The first time she stepped into the room that would one day forget her name. She was 15 and silent, her eyes lowered, her hands trembling beneath the weight of silk too fine for her history. The hallway leading to her quarters smelled of pine and distant rain, the floor polished so smoothly that her bare feet felt like they were gliding over water. Lanterns flickered along the walls, casting warm pools of golden light that shimmered across the paper panels, dancing with every stir of the wind that whispered through unseen cracks. She did not know where to place her eyes, for everything around her was beautiful in a way that made her feel small, delicate, and out of place. The madam walked ahead, her steps measured and soft, the rustle of her layered kimono like the rustling of leaves brushing past stone. No words were spoken. None were needed. The walls had ears, or so she had been told, and even if they didn't, silence was safer than the sound of a voice betraying fear. Her mother had not come with her. Only a folded note in her sleeve, a farewell spoken through tears that had dried. Quickly, once the house's attendants took her hand and guided her through the narrow gate. That was hours ago, or minutes, or days' time had become slippery. Her name was still hers, but even that now felt like something borrowed, something too loud to say in this place of whispers and ritual. When she finally entered the room meant, for her, she did not look around. She kept her gaze fixed on the mat beneath her knees and waited. The madam gestured to the older woman waiting inside, who stepped forward without sound, as if emerging from the shadows. Her hair was coiled into a perfect crown, her face painted into stillness, her presence as quiet and heavy as incense. She knelt beside the girl, hands cool against her shoulders, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, with a voice low and steady, she spoke. "You will sleep here. You will rise before the sun. You will watch and learn. You will not ask questions." The girl nodded. The woman continued. "For now, you are silence. One day, you will become sound." That night, she slept on a futon that smelled of lavender and old wood, the ceiling above her lined with dark beams that seemed to stretch farther than they should. She did not cry. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because crying would mean remembering the warmth of her mother's hands, the way she used to hum while hanging laundry, the sound of their small home's paper door creaking when the wind pushed it open. If she cried, she would unravel, and she had already been wrapped in too many layers to survive that. In the morning, she was woken not by voice, but by the soft clink of porcelain as tea was poured into cups in the hallway. The other girls were already dressed, their movements precise, their faces unreadable. She followed, mimicked, learned without asking. She learned how to kneel without shifting, how to pour tea without spilling, how to fold a napkin so that it resembled a crane. She learned how to bow just deeply enough to show respect, but not so deeply as to imply submission. She learned that her smile should be slight, her laughter soft, her eyes lowered just enough to be graceful, never evasive. By the end of the week, her feet ached from practice, her knees burned from kneeling, her back throbbed from sitting straight for hours without leaning against anything. But she did not complain. Complaints were for children, and she was no longer one. On the 7th night, she was dressed in the ceremonial kimono for the first time, not for clients, but for observation. The fabric was heavy, brocaded with cranes and chrysanthemums, the sleeves so long they touched the floor when she extended her arms. 2 older girls worked in tandem to dress her, speaking only in glances and nods, their hands moving like dancers in an old play. They tied the obi with practiced precision, smoothed the collar, adjusted her hairpins. When she was finally led to the reception room, she felt like a ghost moving through another girl's life. She sat behind the screen, watching the older women perform. They spoke with elegance, moved with poise, sipped sake like it was moonlight. Their laughter was controlled, their gestures precise. Every movement had meaning. Every word, weight. The client's men in robes finer than any she had seen before watched with rapt attention, their eyes filled with admiration, desire, amusement. She understood, even then, that she was witnessing theater. Not deception, but art. A performance. Not to trick, but to please, to elevate, to enchant. She was not ready to take part. Not yet. But something inside her stirred. Not ambition. Not excitement. Something quieter. Curiosity. On her way back to her room, she passed one of the older courtesans in the corridor, a woman whose presence silenced conversation and straightened spines. She paused as the girl bowed. The woman looked at her for a long moment, then said, "The first night is always the longest, but it ends." Then she continued walking. The girl stood there a while, unsure whether the words were meant as comfort or warning. Perhaps both. That night, she lay awake longer than usual, the weight of the silk still lingering on her skin, the scent of perfume still clinging to her hair. She thought of the older woman's words. She thought of the screen that separated her from the men. She thought of the sound of laughter that wasn't quite real. She thought of her own silence. She did not yet understand her place in this world, but she understood this. She was a thread in a tapestry far older than herself. And for now, that was enough. Her days began before the world was awake, when the air was still damp with dreams and the sky hovered somewhere between blue and gray. She would rise with the others, her movements slow at first, her limbs still unfamiliar with obedience, but soon smoothing into the rhythm that guided the house. Each gesture was borrowed at first, how to fold the bedding, how to rinse her mouth. With quiet efficiency, how to walk without announcing her presence. The older girls did not instruct her with words, but with presence. If she watched closely, she saw the lessons hidden in the way they combed their hair, in how they held the tray with both hands as though it carried not tea, but a piece of the moon. There was no praise for learning quickly. There was only less correction. She began to understand that in this world, invisibility was a virtue. Not the kind that came from being ignored, but the kind that was cultivated, deliberate, powerful. To move without being noticed was not to be lesser. It was to be in control. The more she learned, the more she disappeared, and in doing so, she became more of what they wanted her to be. The madam did not speak often, but her eyes missed nothing. Once, while the girl was sweeping the hallway, the broom hesitated for a second too long over a fallen petal. The madam passed, paused, said nothing, and continued on. That evening, the girl practiced sweeping for an hour after everyone else had gone to bed. The petal was gone, but she remembered its weight. The tea ceremonies became her next challenge. Every step, every pour, every glance had to be choreographed. The goal was not to serve tea, but to become the act of serving tea itself. She was told to imagine herself as part of the room, no more significant than the scroll on the wall, no louder than the ripple in the teacup. She learned to kneel without complaint, to hide the discomfort behind a serene expression. Her muscles burned, her knees bruised, but she never shifted. Stillness, she was told, was strength. A moving woman draws attention, a still woman holds it. Weeks passed, then months, and she began to forget what her own voice sounded like. She had not spoken in more than hushed replies since the night. She arrived. At first, she missed the sound of herself, the laughter she used to share with her mother, the careless songs she hummed while fetching water. But gradually, the silence became a comfort. In this new world, words could betray you, expose you, bind you to the wrong perception. Silence, on the other hand, allowed room to become whatever was needed. One morning she was summoned to the garden. An older courtesan, seated beneath a plum tree, gestured for her to sit. The woman's name was Suru, and she was known for her grace, her wit, and the way she never needed to raise her voice to command a room. Suru looked at her with a gaze that felt both gentle and piercing. "Do you know why we paint our faces?" "White?" she asked. The girl shook her head. "Because white is the color of death," Suru said calmly. "We are alive, but we wear the mask of spirits. We are not girls, we are not wives. We are not daughters, we are ghosts of beauty. Seen, but not touched. Desired, but never owned. Do you understand?" The girl didn't. Not fully, but she nodded. She would come to understand later. That afternoon, she practiced her walk. The first step was to learn how to float. Her feet barely lifting, toes brushing the floor in careful succession. The sleeves of her training kimono had been lengthened slightly to weigh her down, forcing her to find balance. Every misstep earned her a silent correction, sometimes a nod, sometimes a sigh. She fell. Once, the others did not laugh. Suru simply offered her a hand, then let go before she had regained her footing. "You must learn to catch yourself," she said. "There will not always be someone nearby." That night, she soaked her feet in warm water, watching the steam rise like spirits returning to the sky. Her toes were blistered, the skin rubbed. Raw in places, but she did not cry. She massaged them slowly, whispering nothing, only breathing. She had begun to feel a shift within her. Not pride was too loud, but something softer. A sense of shape forming inside what had once been uncertainty. She was not yet a courtesan, but she was no longer a girl who did not know how to move in silk. The seasons changed. She marked them not by holidays, but by the color of the blossoms in the garden, the fragrance of incense used in the corridors. Spring brought camellia oil for their hair, summer the scent of citrus on their sleeves. Autumn arrived with maple leaves pressed into envelopes sent by distant clients, and winter brought the hush of snow muffling the sound of laughter. In each passing day, she became more fluent in the unspoken language of the house. She knew which footsteps meant business and which meant gossip. She could identify a girl's mood by the angle of her bow. She understood how to offer comfort without words, how to receive criticism without showing pain. Her name was still spoken, but more rarely now. The others began referring to her by role, not by identity, the new one, the quiet one. The one with steady hands. It was not meant unkindly. It was a sign she was being absorbed, woven into the fabric of something larger than herself. One evening, as she helped prepare the main reception hall, she caught her reflection in a lacquered tray. For a moment, she didn't recognize the girl who stared back. Her expression was calm, her posture straight, her eyes lowered but aware. She blinked, and in that second, the image vanished, replaced by the swirl of motion around her. But the echo remained. She was becoming. Not by force, but by repetition. Not by desire, but by discipline. She had learned that beauty was not something you were born with. It was something you earned, with silence, with posture, with the daily offering of self into a mold that had been carved long before you arrived. And though she did not yet know the shape of the woman she would become, she could feel her approaching, slowly, surely, like the tide that rises without sound and changes the shore forever. The first time she was allowed to serve in the presence of a guest, the day had unfolded with an eerie stillness, as though even the sky had held its breath in anticipation. She had risen before the lamps were extinguished, her hands cool with morning dew as she washed her face in the stone basin outside her room. Her fingers lingered longer than usual against her cheeks, not out of vanity but out of disbelief. Was this the same skin that would later receive rouge and powder? The same skin that would meet the gaze of a stranger? Her thoughts circled in silence. By the time she had slipped into her undergarments and been led to the dressing chamber, the other women had already begun the transformation. She watched them first, her own movements hesitant as though afraid to touch anything too firmly. But when the attendants gestured for her to step forward, she obeyed, and they began. The brush against her cheeks was soft but insistent. sweeping upward with powdered white. The scent of camellia oil mingled with the coolness of her collar, as it was pulled straight and fastened tightly. Her lips were tinted red, her eyes lined with subtle grace, her hair pinned with ornamental restraint. When they stepped back, she stood taller not with pride, but with precision, the way a calligrapher steps back from the first stroke of a character and waits to see if it will hold. She was not the center of the evening. She was merely assisting, there to pour, to offer, to exist in the margins of conversation without becoming part of it. Yet even in her muted role, she felt exposed, as though the air in the reception room carried weight and temperature she had never noticed before. The guest was already seated when she entered, a man older than her by decades, dressed in charcoal gray silk and bearing the quiet poise of someone used to being observed. He did not look at her at first. He spoke to Suru, who led the evening. With the ease of a river tracing a well-worn path, her laughter punctuated his words like brushstrokes over parchment. She responded with grace, with rhythm, and yet behind her performance, there was a constant awareness of everything around her. Every flicker of the lanterns, every shift in the wind, every blink from the girl standing quietly beside the tea. When Suru signaled, she moved. She knelt without sound, lifted the teapot without spill, and poured a slow, deliberate stream into the porcelain cup before him. Only then did he look at her. His gaze was not sharp, not seeking. It was soft and slow, like someone studying a painting for the second time. She lowered her eyes, not out of fear, but from instinct, as she had been taught. Yet something in the way he looked measured still made her wonder if he had noticed the tremor she could feel just beneath her ribs. He said nothing. She stepped back, resumed her post, and tried to quiet the thoughts racing through her mind. She told herself he was just another man. He was not her first, nor would he be her last. But then, he was her first. The first to look and not only see the artifice, but to pause, as if unsure whether to believe it or question it. The conversation continued without her. Suru spoke of poetry and lantern festivals, of moonlit walks and rare orchids gifted by long-dead admirers. She spoke with practiced delight, her words painting scenes that the guest nodded along with, even as his eyes occasionally returned to the silent girl beside the wall. It was not desire in his look, nor was it pity. If anything, it was recognition, as though he too had once been a page on which someone else had written. When he rose to leave, he turned to her and said, "You hold your breath when you pour. One day you won't," she bowed, not deeply, not quickly, just enough. Enough to let him go and keep his words with her. That night, she did not sleep immediately. She returned to the stone basin where she had washed her face that morning and stared into the water. Her reflection was faint, broken by the breeze. She dipped her fingers in and watched the ripples erase what little she could see. She wondered what the man had meant. She wondered if he was right. Had she held her breath? She could not remember. She would remember only the way his voice had landed, not heavy, not commanding, but like a leaf falling on still water. The next morning, Tsuru said nothing about the previous night. But during the tea rehearsal, when the girl hesitated slightly, before lifting the pot, Tsuru placed her hand over hers and said, "Breathe. Always breathe. They'll forget what you said. They'll remember how you made them feel." She didn't need to be told again. In the days that followed, she tried to make her movements lighter, her posture more open, her presence less rigid. She did not force herself to smile more, but she allowed stillness to come from peace instead of fear. She began to notice things she hadn't before, how the lacquered trays reflected candlelight like pools of gold, how the smell of incense shifted slightly depending on which room she entered, how the older women adjusted their hairpins not just for balance, but for mood. She saw it all now. She was no longer a blank page. She had begun to absorb ink, and sometimes when she passed the reception room, she would glance at the place where the guest had sat. It was always empty, but her mind filled it with his presence, not out of longing, but as a reminder. He had seen her, not as someone she was trying to become, but as someone she already was. That thought did not frighten her. It gave her grounding. Her name was still rarely used, but in her heart, something had started to take root, a quiet confidence, delicate but unshakable. She was still learning, still falling into roles, still adjusting the mask. But now she knew there was someone behind it, breathing. By now, she could predict the sounds of the house before they came, the creak of a door before dawn, the scratch of ink on parchment from the scribe's room, the stifled giggle of two girls sneaking plum candy between lessons. It had become a living instrument, this house, each voice, each footstep, each breath, another note in a never-ending song. She was a part of it now, a note so subtle it often went unnoticed, and that invisibility had grown into comfort. But comfort is not the same as stillness. Beneath the surface of routine, something stirred a question she had not yet dared to name. She was summoned one afternoon to accompany Suru again, this time to a private tea engagement. No other courtesans were present, and no attendants either. Just the two of them, and the same guest she had once served tea to in silence. The room they entered was smaller, more intimate. The lanterns were dimmed, and the incense was different, woodsy, almost damp, like fallen leaves in the forest after rain. She knelt slightly behind Suru, her gaze lowered, but she felt his presence like a shift in temperature. When Suru poured the first cup of tea, she gestured gently for the girl to take over. With fingers steady from weeks of practice, she accepted the pot and performed the ritual, her hands tracing the shapes they had been trained to make. This time, she remembered to breathe. When she handed the cup to the man, he met her eyes not boldly, not with intent, but with quiet attentiveness, as if saying, "I am here, and I see that you are too." Suru spoke, as she always did, with grace and charm. She told a story about a snow-covered bridge in Kyoto, about a winter so silent that even the crows stopped calling. Her voice carried the scent of nostalgia, and the guest responded with soft laughter and thoughtful questions. The girl remained quiet, as expected. But as she refilled his cup, he asked her a question. "What do you think snow sounds like when it lands?" It was not a question with an answer, not one she had prepared for. She looked at Suru, unsure whether to speak. Suru gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. Permission. She spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, like silk brushing against silk, she said. He smiled. "That's a beautiful answer." The conversation moved on, but her heart remained caught in that single moment. She had spoken, and the room had not shattered. The mask had not slipped. If anything, it felt a little more real. After the engagement ended, and they walked back through the corridor together, Suru slowed her pace until they were side by side. She didn't speak immediately. When she finally did, her voice was neither praise nor warning. Words are like perfume. A little leaves an impression, too much leaves a stain. The girl nodded. She understood. The next time she served tea, she chose silence again. But it was no longer the same kind of silence. This one was deliberate, thoughtful, even playful in its restraint. When clients tried to draw her out with questions, she gave soft smiles and glanced toward the older courtesans, deferring with grace. She had learned the power of withholding. And yet, each time she was invited into a room with the man who had once asked about snow, she found herself more open, more at ease. He did not pry. He did not flatter. He simply made space for her to exist, not as a perfect figure, but as a person made of breath and thought. In one such evening, he told a story of a crane he once followed through a garden in Nara. The bird, he said, had walked with such elegance that he felt foolish for ever thinking humans had mastered grace. When she laughed a quiet, genuine sound, he did not react with surprise or triumph. He simply continued, as though her response had been part of the story all along. In these encounters, she began to feel the lines blur. Between performance and presence. Between mask and face. Between duty and desire. Not desire in the way the house taught it, not the kind exchanged for gifts or poems, but the desire to be known not fully, not greedily, but gently, in fragments. Still, she guarded herself. She remembered Suru's words, the wisdom etched. In caution, to give too much too soon was to break the illusion. And without illusion, there could be no beauty. One evening, after a gathering that ended later than usual, she lingered in the garden. The moon hung low, a pale coin balanced between branches. The pond was still, the koi asleep beneath its surface. She removed her sandals and stepped onto the cold stone path, her toes curling against the smoothness. She walked slowly, deliberately, as if the air might catch fire if she moved too quickly. When she reached the small bench beneath the plum tree, she sat and let the silence settle. She thought of the first night she had arrived. She thought of her mother's hands. She thought of the man who asked her about snow. And for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, if she were not here, not this, who would she be? It was a dangerous thought. Dangerous because it led nowhere. There was no path outside this place. No home waiting. No name to return to. Her identity had been reshaped, lacquered, and polished until it gleamed. To look beneath that surface was to invite pain. And yet, even in that fear, a strange sense of possibility flickered. Like a candle in wind flickering, but not yet extinguished. The next morning, she rose earlier than usual. Not because she had been summoned, but because she needed to walk. Not far, just through the corridors before others stirred through. The narrow spaces where silence was thickest. She paused before a closed door, the room where she had first been painted, first bound into silks, first learned to lower her gaze. She placed her palm against the wood. The warmth of memory pulsed faintly through it. And in that moment, she understood something vital. The girl who had once stepped inside, trembling and silent, was still here. Not buried, not erased. Just quieter now, watching, waiting, and perhaps someday, ready to speak again. There came a time when the scent of her own sleeves became familiar, when the rustle of her silk echoed a rhythm that no longer startled her, when the weight of her presence in a room no longer felt borrowed but earned. It happened gradually, not like a door opening, but like light slowly pushing away darkness in the hour before dawn. She noticed it first when a younger girl, newly arrived, watched her the way she had once watched Suru, with curiosity cloaked in reverence, with that hungry silence that devours every gesture as if it were scripture. The girl didn't speak, but her eyes never wavered, and in those eyes she saw herself, remembered herself. The trembling beginnings of a name being erased and rewritten in powder and form. She smiled gently at the girl once, not with pity, not with warning, but with quiet solidarity, a flicker of reassurance that said, "I know." One morning, she was handed a folded piece of rice paper by the house attendant. No name, no signature, just a single line of elegant script that read, "The sound of cranes kept me company. I wondered if one had your voice." There was no need for a reply. But that evening, when she sat in the reception room with other clients, she made sure to hum the beginning of a melody as she poured the first cup of sake, a tune light and fleeting like birds over water. She did not look to see if he was listening. She knew he was. These exchanges, silent-coded, ephemeral, were not rare in the house, but rarely did they matter. Yet with him, something different stirred. Not love. No, she was too well trained, too deeply embedded in performance to mistake attention for affection. But it was something adjacent, the way a shadow follows light, the way a thought lingers after the words are gone. She was beginning to understand. The delicate balance between appearing and disappearing, between presence and performance. She could be seen without surrendering. She could be noticed without yielding her shape, but it took effort. Every smile required intention. Every silence required awareness. It was an art not unlike painting, where what was left blank was just as important as what was filled. The madam took notice. One afternoon, she summoned her privately. The room was sparse, the air still. The madam poured tea herself, which was rare, and said nothing until they both had taken a sip. Then, with eyes that had measured 100 girls before her, she asked, "Do you know what you're becoming?" The girl did not answer right away. Then she said softly, "A mirror." The madam nodded once. "Good, but remember mirrors. Reflect what is in front of them. Never let yourself forget what's behind." That night, she dreamed of her mother, not as she had last seen her, but younger, her hair looser, laughing as she turned to call her in from the field. The dream smelled of summer rain and rice steam, and felt so real that she awoke with tears. Already halfway down her cheek, she wiped them quickly. Tears were not forbidden, but they were impractical. They blurred the lines she had worked so hard to keep sharp. And yet, she allowed herself to remember, briefly. The next evening brought a festival. Lanterns were lit throughout the pleasure district, their glow painting the night in gold and crimson. The streets echoed with music, the laughter of clients, the clatter of Geta sandals over stone. The house was alive with activity, women moving like waves in silks the color of pomegranate and moonlight. She was dressed in deeper hues that night, indigo and silver, with a fan painted in clouds tucked into her obi. When she stepped into the room, conversation quieted for the briefest moment, just long enough for her to know she had arrived. Among the guests was a man she had never seen before, younger than most, with eyes that darted and hands that twitched slightly at the edges of his robe. He was a poet, they said. A rising one, eccentric, talented, unpredictable. He spoke too quickly, laughed too loudly, and complimented too often. He fixated on her. "You walk like a sigh," he said within minutes. "And your voice have. You swallowed starlight." She responded with a tilt of her head, the smallest lift of an eyebrow. It was enough to make the others laugh, and he flushed, unsure whether he had been charmed or dismissed. Later, he offered her a poem, hastily written on the back of a menu. It was clumsy and grand, filled with metaphors that tumbled over each other like boys fighting for attention. She accepted it with a bow and folded it carefully before slipping it into her sleeve. He watched her with anticipation, but she said nothing. When he left, he looked disappointed, as though he had expected her to be more moved, more generous, more grateful. But gratitude had to be earned, and she was no longer so easily swayed by verses that tripped over their own urgency. Still, that night, alone in her room, she unfolded the poem and read it again, not because it was beautiful, but because it was honest. And in its rawness, she found something familiar. Once, she too had reached clumsily for meaning. Once, she too had tried too hard. The paper smelled faintly of plum wine and ink, and she tucked it beneath her pillow without understanding why. Days turned into weeks, and her presence was requested. More often. Her name, carefully chosen for its elegance and softness, was spoken by clients with a kind of reverence that made the younger girls whisper when she passed. She did not preen. She did not boast. But she walked a little taller, her movements a little slower, each gesture rooted in a confidence that had grown not from vanity, but from clarity. She knew who she was within these walls, not just a performance, not just a mask, but a story being written in brushstrokes of silence, posture, and gaze. One evening, Suru came to her room. She hadn't visited in weeks. They sat together without speaking for a long time. Then Suru reached into her sleeve and pulled out a small folded note. "He's leaving," she said simply. The girl did not need to ask who. He asked if he could say goodbye. She hesitated, then shook her head. "No." Suru nodded once, then placed the note on the table and left. The girl sat there, staring at the folded paper. She never opened it. Not because she didn't care, but because she did. Some words are too heavy to be read. Some goodbyes too delicate to survive the weight of language. She placed the note beside the clumsy poem beneath her pillow and extinguished the lamp. The room fell into darkness, and she listened to the quiet. Not for footsteps, not for voices, just for herself, her breath, her heartbeat. The sound of a woman who had learned how to be both present and distant, how to give enough and keep something sacred untouched. And in the silence, she smiled, not out of triumph, not out of regret, but with the quiet knowing of someone who had paid the price of presence and found herself still whole. There came a day when her hands no longer trembled while tying the obi of her kimono, when her feet slid across the wooden floor with such grace that the panels beneath seemed to hold their breath, when her voice, though rarely used, had acquired a tone so measured that even silence bowed in its presence. The house knew her now not merely as a girl who had survived the transformation, but as one who had become the transformation itself. And with that came a shift. One morning, the madam approached her in the hallway with a quiet nod and a simple phrase, "The new girl is yours." No further explanation was needed. She had seen it happen before, how the more seasoned courtesans would begin to carry the weight of guiding the next. It was not a promotion, it was a responsibility, and one she accepted with a bow and the same poise she had learned from those who had once watched over her. The girl was called Aki, though that name, like all names within the house, would soon become more of an ornament than an identity. She was small, with wide eyes and quick fingers that betrayed both curiosity and fear. On the first day, she spoke too much. She laughed too easily. She moved like a child who had wandered into a room of ghosts. The woman, no longer just a girl, now did not scold her. She merely walked, slowly, letting Aki follow, and waited for silence to return. In teaching, she found herself returning to lessons she had never fully understood until now. How to bow without apology. How to hold a teacup as if cradling something fragile, but never precious. How to walk through a room without leaving a trace yet altering the atmosphere entirely. Aki struggled. She wept once after failing to hold her kneel during the long rehearsal. The woman said nothing. Instead, she knelt beside her in silence for several long breaths, then rose and walked away. That was all it took. Aki stopped crying after that, not out of fear, but out of understanding. In her, the woman saw echoes of herself, the same ache of transition, the same confusion when faced with contradiction. She remembered how she had once longed to be seen, and then feared it when the gaze arrived. She remembered the disorientation of becoming a symbol before knowing who she was, and so she chose to guide with restraint. She did not instruct with severity, nor with affection. She led with example, with presence. One evening, Aki asked, "How do you stay so still?" They were folding linens in the quiet room where guests were never allowed. The lamps glowed low, and the air smelled faintly of pressed paper and dust. The woman paused, her fingers smoothing the fabric as if in thought. Then she said, "By remembering that movement is not freedom." Aki didn't understand, not fully. But she nodded, and the silence between them deepened, not with distance, but with the weight of shared effort. In the weeks that followed, Aki improved. Her movements became softer, her voice more measured. She still tripped occasionally over the long sleeves of her kimono, still forgot to bow at the correct angle, but she listened. She watched. She learned. And the woman found herself watching too, not just Aki, but herself, reflected back through the girl's struggles and small victories. She saw where she had hardened, where she had healed, where she still held tension like a thread pulled too tight. One afternoon, as they practiced the tea ceremony together, Aki spilled a few drops of water onto the mat. She froze, eyes wide, waiting for reprimand. Instead, the woman took the cloth, blotted the spill, and said, "A drop does not drown a ceremony." It was the first time she had seen Aki smile without guilt. That night, the woman sat in her room alone and unwrapped a bundle of letters she had kept hidden beneath the floorboards. Most were from admirers, written in the same flowery prose that coated too many evenings with sugar. But one was different. The letter she had never opened. The one from the man who had once asked her about snow. Her fingers hovered above the crease. Then, gently she folded it once more and placed it back. Not from fear, but from acceptance. Some words, she had realized, do not need to be read to be understood. Some connections are not lines but loops, quiet, continuous, unbroken, even by distance. The next morning, Aki surprised her with a question. "Were you ever in love?" It was asked casually, over breakfast, when the scent of rice and miso filled the room. The woman paused mid-bite, set her chopsticks down, and looked at the girl. Then, after a moment, she said, "Not in the way stories tell it." Aki tilted her head. "Then how?" The woman sipped her tea. "In the way a breeze might love. A flame, close enough to give it life, distant enough not to extinguish it." Aki stared at her, wide-eyed, then whispered, "I hope I'm loved like that someday." The woman smiled, not because she believed it would happen, but because she hoped it might. In that moment, she felt both young and old carrying within her the weight of every ritual, every silence, every glance that had passed unspoken but understood. She had become what the house needed, but she had also somehow managed to keep something for herself, a room within a room, a story behind the story, a truth unshaped by the expectations of others. That evening, as the lamps were lit and the rooms filled with the scent of perfume and polished wood, she watched Aki walk through the corridor with her sleeves raised just enough to glide. Her steps were not perfect, but they no longer stumbled. The woman watched her disappear into the reception room and exhaled slowly. She turned alone now and walked toward the garden. The moon was pale above, its reflection trembling in the pond. She stood for a long time, breathing the cool night air, letting it wrap around her like a robe. She had learned to be silent. She had taught another to listen. And in doing so, she had heard herself more clearly than ever before. The wind shifted. A petal floated down from the plum tree and landed on her shoulder. She did not brush it away. She had almost forgotten what her given name sounded like when spoken aloud. Not the name bestowed upon her within the house, the one that danced on clients' tongues like a flower too fragrant to last, but the name whispered in warm kitchens and along quiet riverbanks, the name sewn into the fabric of old clothes folded by familiar hands. It had been years, maybe more. Time in the house was circular. Seasons passed, yes, but within its walls, days folded into one another like layers of silk. There was no calendar here. Only rituals. Only the sound of footsteps on wood, the hush of rain on tiles, the soft intake of breath before a song. And so it was a strange sensation when on an otherwise unremarkable evening she heard it. Her real name, not loudly, not from the lips of a client, but from behind a paper screen, in a voice so young it sounded almost imaginary. "She used to sing to the plum trees," the voice said. "That's what my grandmother said." The woman froze. Her heart did not race, but paused as if unsure whether to resume. She stood outside the screen, unseen, uninvited, listening to a conversation not meant for her. Two girls were talking. One barely older than Aki, the other still in her first year of training. "Who?" the younger one asked. "She didn't say her name," said the first. "Just that she came from the village near the wide river. Just like you." The woman stepped away, not hurriedly, not noiselessly, just far enough that the whisper of her sandals over stone would erase the last few words from their memory. But not from hers. That night, she could not sleep. She sat at her mirror and stared not at her reflection, but at the lacquered frame, the way the candlelight pooled along its edge like liquid gold. She remembered the plum trees of her childhood, tall and wild, with branches that clawed at the sky in spring. She remembered humming to them, not because she had been taught to, but because the wind felt less empty when it carried song. She did not cry. She hadn't cried in years. But a stillness settled over her chest, like snow on an untrodden path. The next day, she walked through the house with the same grace as always. She poured tea, laughed softly, complimented the poem, offered by a clumsy admirer with the appropriate tilt of the head. No one noticed anything had changed. Except Aki. In the hallway between appointments, Aki looked at her and said, "Your eyes are quieter today." It was not a question. The woman gave no answer. Instead, she reached out and gently adjusted the fold in Aki's obi. "Straight lines," she murmured, "even in wind." That night, after the last guest had left and the candles had been snuffed one by one, she made her way to the archives. It was a rarely used room at the back of the house, where old guest records and forgotten inventory lists were kept. She wasn't looking for anything specific, only a trace, a thread, a map back to the name she had buried. The room smelled of dust and ink and long-dried perfume. She ran her fingers over the shelves, over ledgers with faded bindings and scrolls tied with ribbon, brittle from time. Finally, she found a record from her first year. Not under her birth name, of course, but the house name she had been given, then simpler, less adorned. It was strange to see it written by someone else's hand. Strange to think that there was once a version of her who did not yet know how to kneel properly, who spilled water while learning to pour, who flinched when touched too suddenly. She traced the characters with her fingertip. Below them, a short note from the madam of that time. "Quiet, watchful, will become something rare if the silence doesn't swallow her." She closed the book. She was still quiet, still watchful. But the silence had not swallowed her. She had learned to use it as a blade, a balm, a brushstroke. A few nights later, during a gathering with guests who spoke too loudly and drank too much, one of them remarked on her calmness. "You have the eyes of someone who's lived 3 lives," he slurred. She smiled, poured another cup, and said, "Only 2. I'm still living the 3rd. He laughed, not understanding. That was the point. Not everything needed to be understood. The following morning, a letter arrived, folded simply, with no ornament. Inside, only one sentence. "There is someone in the village who still sings to the plum trees." She read it once, then again. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The messenger had not given a name. She placed the letter beside the unopened one, under her floorboard, and sat by the window. Outside, the sun rose slowly, warming the roof tiles and painting shadows that stretched like arms reaching home. She did not ask the madam for leave. She did not write a reply. She simply waited, because some messages were not invitations. They were reminders. And some roots, no matter how deeply cut, remember the shape of their soil. Later that week, Aki asked her to help choose a hairpin for her next performance. "Something with a story," she said. The woman opened her small lacquer box and revealed a pin shaped like a crane in flight. Silver with a touch of blue enamel along the wings. "This was given to me," she said, "by someone who once mistook quiet for mystery." Aki's eyes widened. Was he wrong? The woman smiled. "Not entirely. But mystery fades. Silence stays." Aki nodded solemnly, as though she understood. Maybe she did. Maybe she would. In time. That evening, as she prepared for another round of laughter and poems, and sake poured in the rhythm of practiced affection, the woman paused before the mirror again. This time, she looked directly at her reflection. She whispered her birth name. Aloud, just once. The sound barely reached her ears, but it reached somewhere deeper. Somewhere beneath the silks and layers, the practiced bows and rehearsed glances. It settled there, softly, like dust on a windowsill no one remembers to clean. And for a moment, brief, delicate, unshakable, she was not the image others adored. She was the girl beneath the plum trees, singing. She had not stepped beyond the district gates in over 5 years. Within those walls, the world was ordered, choreographed, a theater where each moment was measured in scent, silence, and grace. But when the letter came again, written in the same unadorned script, no name, no seal, only a single line, it stirred something more than memory. "The plum trees have bloomed," it said. She tried to ignore it. She folded it, placed it with the others, and went about her duties. But her hands betrayed her, lingering too long on the rim of a teacup, her fingers resting a moment too long on the lacquer of the shamisen. That night, she could not sleep. She sat at the window, watching the moonlight cast its quiet tapestry across the courtyard tiles. The night air smelled faintly of wood smoke. Something in it reminded her of old seasons, of winter nights and cracked palms, of firewood carried in arms that ached. At dawn, she did not report to the dressing room. She walked to the back gate instead. The attendant said nothing when she passed, only bowed slightly, eyes downcast. It was not unusual for women of her status in the house to take a day of leave now and then. But what was unusual, what shocked her most, was how unfamiliar the street beyond the gate felt beneath her feet. It was the same city, but it moved. Differently, faster, louder. The ground was uneven, and her sandals made small hesitant sounds as she walked. She didn't go far, only to the edge of the market where villagers gathered with baskets and voices. She kept her head low. Her robes, though modest, still marked her. A seller called out to her, offering persimmons. She nodded, handed over coins, and took the fruit not because she wanted it, but because the gesture made her feel visible, human. She walked toward the river. The same river from her childhood, though it had grown wider in her absence. Its banks were littered with reeds and children's laughter. She stayed just long enough to watch a crane land on a rock near the center, its wings folding like a poem. Finished and resting, then she turned back. She did not return to the house right away. Instead, she stopped at a temple, one she had passed many times but never entered. The incense choked the air inside, thick with prayers and unspoken regrets. She stood in the shadow of the altar, her hands pressed together, not quite sure what she was asking for. Maybe nothing. Maybe just to be still. A monk passed behind her and paused. "You carry quiet like a lantern," he said. She opened her eyes. He did not look at her. "Let it guide you, not burn you." She left without a word. That evening, she returned to her room, folded her outer robe, and placed it with unusual care at the foot of her mat. She sat before the mirror again, but did not light the candle. In the dark, her reflection was only shadow, her outline barely visible. And yet, she saw herself more clearly than she had in years. In the days that followed, she resumed her routines. She poured, she played, she smiled. But something had shifted. Not broken, not unraveled, just moved, realigned. Aki noticed it first. "You're gentler now," she said during a break. "Between rehearsals, were you harsh before?" The woman asked, half teasing. Aki shook her head. "Not harsh, just sharper. Like snow before it melts." The woman said nothing, but that night she wrote a letter. Her first in years. It was not long. It said only, "The bloom has faded, but the roots remain." She didn't send it. She folded it, tied it with red string, and placed it beside the others. A new season had begun within her. One not marked by the moon or the market, but by the quiet decision to remember without pain. One afternoon, while helping Aki prepare for a client, the girl asked, "Did you ever want to leave?" The question floated between them, too bold to be taken lightly, too innocent to be punished. The woman adjusted Aki's hairpin before responding. "Wanting is not the same as choosing. Aki frowned. So, you chose to stay? The woman paused, then nodded. Every day. In small ways. Aki did not ask more. Perhaps she understood. Or perhaps she was too young to need the answer to be more than that. That evening, the house held a banquet. Important guests. The air was thick with clove smoke and stories retold for their familiarity rather than their wit. She sat among them. Poised, radiant, each movement deliberate. She performed the way a flame performs. Warm, dancing, but untouchable. One guest, a wealthy merchant with kind eyes and careful hands, offered her a ring. Jade, carved with a dragon. For your elegance, he said. A gift, not a request. She accepted it with a nod. But later, in her room, she placed the ring in a box that held other such things. Trinkets, tokens, things, offered to her in exchange for moments that could never quite be owned. As she closed the box, her fingers brushed the folded letters. She held them a while. Then, for the first time, she untied the red string. She did not read them all, only the last one. The ink had faded slightly, the paper soft with time. But the words remained, steady, unchanged. There is someone in the village who still sings to the plum trees. She smiled, and this time it was not sad. She imagined the trees, how they must have grown, twisted, survived storms. She imagined the wind passing through them, catching in their branches like breath. The next morning, she plucked a single blossom from the house's inner garden and tucked it behind her ear. No one commented. But Suru, passing her in the corridor, paused briefly. Spring suits you, she said, then continued walking. The woman stood for a moment, fingers brushing the petal. And in that stillness she felt something solid beneath her, not the past. Not the memory of a name once whispered, but something new, the quiet strength of choosing to remain and letting the world come to her. The lanterns in the corridor were dimmer than usual, their paper skins yellowing with time, casting shadows that flickered like old memories on the walls. She walked beneath them slowly, feeling their breath of light touch her shoulders, as if the house itself was watching her, remembering her from when she first passed beneath these very same lights as a trembling girl with no name and 100 unasked questions in her eyes. Now she carried no questions, only answers shaped like rituals. She was no longer the girl who listened outside the screen, waiting to be summoned. She was the one others waited for. And she was always on time. Her days had grown quieter as her presence grew louder. There were fewer corrections, fewer instructions. Even the madam now spoke to her with the formality once reserved for honored guests. She was not merely respected, she was trusted. And yet, in this quiet ascension, she sometimes found herself returning to the window, staring out into the distance that no longer called her name. One evening, as rain fell in lazy threads against the roof, Aki entered her room without knocking. She did not scold her, she merely looked up. There's a girl downstairs, Aki said, hesitating. New, too young, I think. She won't stop crying. The woman nodded. Bring her here. Aki disappeared and returned minutes later with a girl who couldn't have been more than 12. Her face blotchy, her sleeves soaked with her own tears. She knelt awkwardly on the mat, barely able to sit still. The woman said nothing. She poured tea for the child, let the warmth of the steam fill the silence between them. Only after several minutes did she speak. What's your name? The girl hesitated. I don't know anymore. The woman nodded. Good. Then you're ready to learn a new one. The child's lip trembled, but she said nothing. The woman pushed the teacup gently toward her. Here, it begins with this. And so began. Another cycle, one she had seen many times but never from this side. For days, she watched the new girl from a distance, guiding without command, correcting without sharpness. She had learned that the most powerful instruction often came not in words, but in presence. and her presence had become something like gravity, silent, unseen, but impossible to ignore. The other girls followed her lead not because they were told to, but because they wished to become what she had become. Not adored, but unshakable. The madam approached her one afternoon, her voice lower than usual. "She reminds me of you," she said, referring to the new girl. The woman tilted her head. "Then she be fine." The madam smiled. "I never doubted that." That evening, the woman stood in the reception hall, the air thick with the scent of cedar and perfume, the laughter of men weaving through music and soft conversation. A new client had arrived, a scholar from the north, quiet and observant. He spoke slowly, measuring each sentence like a poem, watching her with eyes that did not seek to possess, only to witness. He did not offer compliments. Instead, he asked questions. "What do you dream about?" She blinked, surprised by the candor. Most men asked what fragrance she wore, or whether she played the shamisen better than her peers. This question felt like a stone dropped into still water. She poured his sake before answering. "That I am water," she said, "flowing through places where no one waits for me." He nodded, said nothing more. But when he left, he bowed more deeply than most. The next time he came, he brought a book. A collection of old poems. He did not give it to her. He placed it on the table between them and said, "Perhaps you already know these." She did. But she read them again that night, each line a thread tied to a place inside her that rarely stirred. One poem lingered. "A single drop falls, and the world becomes new again." Was the silence here? She copied it, slowly, and tucked the copy behind the mirror frame. Aki found her one morning, reciting it softly to herself. "It sounds like you," Aki said. The woman didn't look up. "Then I've said it well." Life within the house moved with rhythm, but it no longer surprised her. She had learned all its currents. Knew when the laughter was real and when it was timed. Knew when a compliment was habit and when it was hunger. And yet, among all the repetition, there were moments small and rare where something unexpected blossomed. A gesture, a glance, a name remembered. One such moment arrived during the festival of paper lights. It was custom for the women of the house to write a wish on thin paper and float it along the canal. Most wrote of beauty, longevity, or wealth. She had always written nothing, sending blank paper into the water. But this year, she wrote a name. Her name, the one given to her by a mother with rough hands and quiet strength. She did not tell anyone. She folded the paper with care, placed it upon the water, and watched as it drifted out of sight, glowing softly in the moonlight. Aki stood beside her. "What did you write?" she asked. The woman smiled. "Something true." That night, she slept without dreams. In the morning, she woke before the sun, walked to the inner courtyard, and lit a single stick of incense. She bowed once deeply and whispered the name again, not to reclaim it, but to release it. The air held the scent of ashen blossoms. It was enough. She was not just the woman beneath the lanterns anymore. She was the one who had outlasted the lanterns. Their paper would tear, their light would fade, but she would remain like the silence after the last note of a song, full and still ringing. It began with a mirror. Not the one she used to adjust her collar or paint her lips. Not the polished lacquer framed in gold, placed carefully upon her vanity like a shrine to the self. This mirror was different, hidden in a quiet hallway, rarely used, its surface worn, its edges dulled by age. She discovered it by accident while escorting a guest to a back parlor one evening. He was a man of little conversation, more interested in the shadows than the performance. After he left, she lingered near the corridor's end, drawn by something unnamed. And there it was, a tall, narrow mirror leaning against the wall, half forgotten. She stepped before it and looked in, but saw nothing. Not because her reflection wasn't there, it was, but it did not look back. It did not move. It did not breathe with her. It was as if the glass held a version of her from another time, still and silent, preserved like an insect caught between pages. She reached out but did not touch it. Instead, she turned and walked away. That night, her dreams were filled with silence, not the gentle hush of sleep, but the heavy kind, like snow falling in a room without windows. She awoke with the sensation of forgetting something important, something vital. The following days passed in their usual rhythm: rehearsals, appointments, tea poured in precisely the right arc. But her steps were quieter, her eyes more distant. Aki noticed first. "You're not all here," she said. The woman looked up from her writing. "Where do you think I am?" Aki hesitated. "Someplace with no walls." The woman said nothing. She closed the notebook and set it aside. That evening, she returned to the mirror. This time, she brought a candle. Its flame flickered as she held it close to the surface. The light danced, but her reflection did not. It remained still, too. Still. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She spoke to herself. "What do you want?" Her voice echoed faintly. No answer. But the silence felt different this time. Not empty, expectant. She left the candle there, burning low into the night. The next morning, the madam requested her presence. Not uncommon, but rare enough to suggest something important. The madam sat with her hands folded, her gaze steady. "There's been a request," she said. "An invitation. A private gathering. Just outside the city." The woman raised an eyebrow. "And?" "They asked for you, by description." The woman waited. "Not by name?" The madam shook her head. "Only by the way you pour tea." The woman smiled, a slow thing. "Then, they remember." The madam hesitated. "Do you wish to go?" The woman tilted her head. "Does it matter?" "Not to the house," the madam said. "But perhaps to you." That night, she prepared quietly. She chose her simplest kimono, deep blue with a single embroidered pine at the hem. No jewelry, no fragrance. Only the faint scent of pressed indigo and rice paper. Aki helped tie her. "Obi, what do you think they want?" the girl asked. The woman looked at her. To remember something they forgot they knew. The journey was short. A small villa by the river, older than it looked. The room she was led to was modest, no music, no other guests. Just one man seated by a low table, his face lined with time. He rose when she entered, bowed. "You haven't changed." He sighed. She did not correct him, did not laugh. She only sat and poured tea. They did not speak of the past, not directly. But it filled the room like steam from the cups, invisible, but present. He asked about the house, the girls, the seasons. She answered with the same grace she offered to strangers. Only once did he break the pattern. "Do you remember the snow?" She paused. "Which one?" "The year it came early," he said. "The year the trees bloomed too soon." She nodded. "It melted before it touched the ground." "Like your voice," he said. The silence stretched then, gentle and long. When she left, he did not ask to see her again. And she did not offer. Some moments are meant to be singular. Like a petal that falls perfectly between steps. On her return, the house was quiet. Aki waited for her in the corridor. "Was it what you expected?" she asked. The woman shook her head. "It was exactly what it wasn't." Aki frowned. "I don't understand." "You will," the woman said, "one day." That evening, she visited the mirror again. This time she brought nothing, no candle, no questions. She stood before it and simply breathed. Her reflection moved with her, slowly, hesitantly, as if learning again how to be hers. She smiled not out of joy, but acknowledgement. She had lived so long as an image that she had forgotten the shape of her own being. The next morning, she did not tie her obi as tightly. She let a strand of hair remain loose. She walked more slowly, not out of fatigue, but out of intention. she began writing again. Not letters, not poems. Just fragments, observations. Today. The tea steamed longer than usual. The new girl's laugh reminded me of spring. I do not miss the name I once had. She stored them in a small box, tucked under her sleeping mat. Aki discovered them one day while cleaning. Are these yours? She asked. They are no one's, the woman replied. Only the house's now. Aki read one aloud. Mirror is not a promise, only a suggestion. What does it mean? The woman thought for a moment. That reflection is not always recognition. That night, the mirror cracked. No one knew how. No one heard the sound. But in the morning, its surface bore a single line, running from top to bottom like a river frozen mid-course. The woman looked at it and did not flinch. She placed her hand against the glass. Her reflection met her evenly. Then she turned and walked away. In the early morning, before the house stirred, before sandals began to tap lightly against wood and voices hummed with daily purpose, she would walk through the garden alone. The stones were cold underfoot, the moss still holding night's dew, and the air was heavy with the scent of camellia. She never walked far, only from one side of the inner courtyard to the other. But in that quiet space, she found the rhythm of herself slow, deliberate, listening. There was something comforting about the sound of nothing. Not silence, but the gentle quiet of things not said. The wind catching in bamboo, a leaf falling without urgency. A koi breaking the surface just once before vanishing again. She had grown to treasure those moments more than applause or affection. In those brief windows between obligation and performance, she felt not like a role being played, but a person simply being. One morning, she noticed a crack in the stone path, small, hairline, barely visible. It hadn't been there before. She bent to examine it, ran her finger along the cool surface. The crack didn't alarm her. If anything, it reassured her. Even stone, firm and ancient, could shift, could change, could hold memory in its fractures. That day, she spoke more softly than usual. Not because she was tired, but because she wanted. Her voice to land like the petals of the camellias, unnoticed until remembered. During a gathering that evening, a guest commented on her stillness. "You move like someone who's waiting for something sacred," he said. She tilted her head. "Or like someone who's already seen it," she replied. He blinked, uncertain whether it was a deflection or a truth. It didn't matter. Both served the same purpose. In the weeks that followed, she took to writing again. Not fragments this time, but memories. Not full stories, not with names or dates, but with sensations. The rice was burned that day, but the sky was kind. The first time I bowed, I didn't know where to place my hands. My mother's sleeve smelled of ash and ginger. She wrote them on slips of thin paper and tied them to the branches of the camellia tree. The girls began to notice. Aki asked first, "Why do you write them?" The woman answered without turning from her task. "Because some things aren't meant to be remembered by people, only by wind." Aki frowned but said nothing. The tree filled slowly white slips among the red blossoms, like snow mingling with flame. One day, the madam walked past and stopped. "You're making a shrine," she said. The woman nodded. "Not for the dead, for the forgotten." The madam stared a moment longer, then walked on. That evening, Suru approached her during preparations. "Do you think they'll read them?" she asked. The woman smiled. Not with eyes. There was a performance that night. A visiting nobleman. Important, wealthy, easily bored. He requested the woman specifically, though they had never met. "They say you're different," he said upon greeting. She poured his tea. "They say many things." He laughed more, out of habit than amusement. Throughout the evening, he tried to charm her, to provoke her, to unravel her silence. But she did not offer more than what the role required. When the music played, she listened. When he asked about her past, she Redirected. When he gifted her a silk fan painted with cranes, she bowed, thanked him, and set it aside. Near the end of the evening, he asked, "Is there anything you want?" She met his gaze then, evenly, gently. Only what cannot be given. He did not press. And when he left, he did not ask for her again. She kept the fan, but never used it. Instead, she placed it behind the camellia tree, among the paper slips, where it caught the morning sun and cast soft shadows over the grass. One morning, Aki brought her a gift, a tiny bird carved from wood, no larger than a fingertip. "I found it in the storeroom," she said. "It's chipped, but it reminded me of you." The woman held the bird in her palm, studying its rough wings. "Why?" "Because it looks like it once flew." She placed the bird on her writing desk. From that day on, it watched over her as she wrote more slips of memory, more gestures toward the wind. The house grew quieter as seasons changed. The plum blossoms faded. The camellias fell. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of early summer. She began to dream more vividly of rivers and fabric, of names she hadn't spoken in decades, but also of light, of rooms with open doors, of breath not held but released. In one dream, she stood beneath a tree that bloomed both red and white. The petals fell without sound, and as they touched the ground, they turned to water. She knelt, cupped her hands and drank. When she awoke, her mouth was dry, but her chest felt full. That morning, she found the new girl still nameless, still learning, staring at the slips in the tree. "Are they real?" the girl asked. "The memories?" The woman knelt beside her. "As real as the tea you'll pour. But they're gone now, aren't they?" "No," the woman said. "They just changed shape." She guided the girl's hand to the paper. "Here, write one." The girl hesitated, then scrawled something in messy strokes. "My sister had a cat that slept on her head," she said. The woman nodded. "Good, now tie it high, so it can see the stars." That night, a breeze came through the house, stronger than usual, rattling doors and extinguishing candles. The camellia tree shivered, and some of the slips broke free, dancing through the air like birds released. She stood at the window and watched them go. She did not chase them, did not mourn. Instead, she whispered, "Carry them well." And the wind answered, not in words, but in a lull that filled the room like the hush between notes. The kind of silence that lingers. The kind that knows there was a door in the back of the house that never fully closed. It didn't creak or swing, didn't call attention to itself, yet it remained always slightly ajar, as though awaiting someone who had not yet decided whether to enter or leave. She passed by it many times without thinking, her hands full of trays or books or folded linens, and in those days it was simply part of the scenery, another soft detail in the texture of the house's endless rhythm. But one morning, just as the sky began to shift from ink to pearl, she paused before it. The breeze had slipped through that gap and brushed her sleeve, and it felt less like wind and more like memory. She stood there a while, looking into the shaded space beyond the threshold, where garden met gravel path, and where the mist still hovered low to the ground like forgotten breath. She did not step through. She merely watched. And in that moment, she realized she had been avoiding this doorway not because it led somewhere, but because it asked something. It asked her to choose, not to leave or to stay, but to understand that she had been standing still out of habit, not intention. That day, she moved differently. Not visibly, no one would have noticed, but inside her, something loosened. She took longer to light her incense. She poured her tea more slowly, watching the spiral of steam rise and vanish. She spoke a little less, listened a little more. Aki caught her humming once and asked what the tune was. "A lullaby," she said. "For what?" "For the parts of me I'm letting sleep." That evening, the camellia tree was nearly bare. Only a few blossoms clung stubbornly to its branches, and most of the paper slips she had tied weeks before had either faded or flown away. She didn't replace them. Instead, she sat beneath the tree for a long time, watching the empty spaces, where memories had once fluttered like prayer flags. She felt no sadness, only stillness, only the sense that even the wind must rest. That night, as rain tapped softly against the eaves, she unpacked an old lacquered box from beneath her bed. Inside were small personal things, a comb given to her by a woman she had once admired, a coin pressed into her palm by a child who had thought her a goddess, a letter never sent, its contents now forgotten, but the weight of its paper still strangely heavy. She touched each object lightly, like greeting a guest who would not stay long. And then, one by one, she placed them into a silk pouch, not to discard them, but to give them peace. The next morning, she gave the pouch to Aki. "Keep it somewhere." "Quiet," she said. "Why?" Aki asked. "Because I no longer need it to remember," the woman replied. "And you might need it to begin." Aki did not ask again. She simply took the pouch and placed it carefully beneath the floorboard, where she kept her own keepsakes, still few, still growing. That afternoon, a guest arrived unexpectedly, a man with a limp and an old traveling coat, smelling of pine and ink. He asked for her by description, not name. When they sat together, he spoke very little. Instead, he drew quick, quiet sketches on thin rice paper, a corner of the garden, a sliver of sleeve, the edge of her profile. "You move like dusk," he said once. "What does dusk move like?" she asked. "Like something finishing without ending." She said nothing more. But when he left, she kept the sketch he had forgotten half-finished, faint as breath, beautiful in its incompletion. She did not hang it. She slipped it beneath the mat where she meditated each morning, as if to remind herself that not all things need to be displayed to be cherished. As the days turned warmer, the light in the house shifted. It came earlier, stayed longer, fell in different angles. Dust floated visibly now in the sunbeams, making the quiet seem more tangible. The girls cleaned less aggressively. They laughed a little more openly. Even the madam, once so rigid, began allowing moments of pause. One afternoon, as the woman arranged flowers in the main hall, the madam approached her. "You've changed. The way this house breathes," she said. The woman didn't stop arranging the stems. No, it was always breathing. I just listened. The madam nodded, then, after a pause, added, "They follow you." "I know. You don't ask them to." "I know," the woman repeated. "But they need something to follow, not someone." That night, she stood at the doorway again, the one that never fully closed. This time she stepped just past it. Not into the garden, not into the world, but just enough to feel the ground cool beneath her feet, the night air lifting her sleeves. She looked back at the house, at the lantern light flickering inside, at the soft silhouettes of girls preparing for sleep or song or memory. She whispered not goodbye, not farewell, but still here, and turned back inside, not to leave. Not yet, but to carry that wind within her, knowing now that the door had always been open, not to escape, but to remind her that staying was also a choice, one she could make again, and again, with quiet, with grace. By late summer, the light in the house had changed again. It spilled into the rooms at a gentler angle, brushing across the tatami mats like a sigh too soft to name. The cicadas were fewer now, their song no longer a chorus but a series of long pauses between notes, and the garden, once bursting with blooms, had quieted into shades of green and memory. She had begun rising earlier than usual, before even the cook or the delivery boy, and would sit in the corridor that faced east, where the sun struck first and longest. In those moments of soft gold and stillness, she would breathe and think of nothing and everything. She no longer kept track of the dates. What mattered more was the way the wind felt on her skin or how the light touched the stones. One morning, she brought out her box of brushes, unused for many seasons, and began painting again. Not portraits, not scenes, not anything intended for eyes beyond her own. Just impressions, the curve of a sleeve in shadow, the memory of laughter painted in gray, a falling petal held midair by a brushstroke. She did not sign them. She did not store them. After each was finished, she would leave it in the hallway, and if it was gone by nightfall, she would not ask who had taken it. She only hoped that whoever did had needed it. Aki noticed. "You don't keep anything anymore," she said one afternoon while sweeping. The woman looked up from her painting. "Why would I?" "Because you might want to remember." The woman smiled. Memories live best in someone else's hands. That night, as the lanterns flickered and girls rehearsed songs in the back room, she took a walk through the outer garden. The stones were warm from the day's heat, and the bamboo swayed gently. She moved slowly, not from fatigue but from reverence. Each step felt like acknowledgement of the earth, of her body, of the fact that she had walked this path so many times that her footprints had disappeared into it. In the far corner, where the plum tree grew, she found a bird's feather soft, pale, almost translucent. She picked it up and turned it in her hand. It was light, nearly weightless. She held it to her chest, then tucked it into the fold of her sleeve, not to keep, but to give back later. The following days passed like water, smooth, clear, without corners. Guests came and went. The girls whispered and learned. The madam gave fewer orders. The woman became something of a shadow, not in absence, but in gentleness. She was there, and yet not imposing. Present, and yet quietly letting go. She stopped correcting the new girls when they made mistakes. Instead, she watched them stumble, recover, try again. She stopped adjusting her mirror, letting it tilt just slightly off angle. And most curiously, she began giving things away. A comb to one girl, a scarf to another. A fan she had loved dearly, placed quietly on the madam's writing table. "Ah, you leaving?" someone finally asked. She turned to them and said, "No, but some things are." One evening, Aki brought her a small wrapped bundle. "Something I think you should have." The woman opened it and found one of her own paintings, one she thought had vanished with the wind. "Why this one?" she asked. Aki shrugged. "Because." It looked like goodbye, but felt like hello. The woman said nothing. She placed the painting near her sleeping mat. That night, she dreamed of a house made of wind. Its walls shimmered. Its doors never closed. And everyone inside spoke not with words, but with gestures, small, kind, careful. When she awoke, she felt no need to explain it. The dream had already happened once before, in the way she had begun to live. The next morning, she returned to the old door behind the house, the one that had always remained slightly open. This time she brought nothing, no questions, no thoughts. She simply stepped outside, walked a few paces into the mist, and turned to look at the house. It looked the same. And yet it didn't. Not because anything had changed, but because she had stopped needing it to. She smiled and stepped back in. She did not tell anyone where she had gone. No one asked. They had begun to understand. That evening, while preparing tea for a guest, the kettle gave a long, low whistle. She paused, then turned off the flame and let the silence settle. "No tea today?" the guest asked. She smiled. "Today the silence is sweeter." The guest said nothing more. And neither did she. After he left, she took the kettle outside and poured the still warm water beneath the camellia tree. 4. "What was never spoken," she whispered. The wind carried her words away. Days grew shorter. The garden began to yellow at the edges. The girls wore thicker layers. And she, for the first time in years, stopped performing entirely, not from weariness, but because she had already given all of herself worth giving. The rest belonged to stillness now. One afternoon, the madam found her sitting by the back corridor, eyes half closed, painting the sound of wind with strokes of gray and silver. "You're not teaching anymore," the madam said. "I'm learning," the woman replied. "What could you possibly be learning?" "How to leave things behind," she answered. "Without looking like I'm going," the madam nodded. She said no more. That evening, the girls sang softly, and as their voices filled the house, the woman tied one final paper to the bare camellia branch. It read, "Some things stay not because they must, but because they no longer need to move." And when the wind came that night, she did not watch it go. She no longer moved through the house as its centerpiece, but as its breath, gentle, rhythmic, mostly unseen, but always present. Where once her laughter had been a lantern in the dark, now her silence was a blanket stretched softly across the hours. The girls still came to her, not for correction, but for comfort, not to be shaped, but simply to be heard. She had become less a teacher and more a reflection, holding space rather than molding it. Even the madam had noticed the shift. "You've disappeared in plain sight," she remarked one morning. The woman nodded, placing a sprig of pine in a vase. "Isn't that what winter teaches us?" There was no performance that evening, no feast, no guests requesting dances or games. Just the quiet murmur of slippers on wood, the faint sound of humming as girls folded garments, and the sharp scent of roasted barley from the kitchen. It was the kind of night most forgot, but she cherished those nights most, the ones that asked nothing but presence. She sat by the window and watched the branches sway. She noticed, for the first time in years, how the shadow of the camellia tree stretched across the courtyard like a reaching hand. She traced it with her eyes until it disappeared into the gravel. The past few weeks had been full of gestures, small, subtle, weightless. A girl leaving tea on her windowsill, a comb placed gently on her mat, the sound of footsteps pausing just outside her door, then continuing. It was as if the house itself had learned to breathe with her, to move without demanding. One afternoon, she entered the storage room again, the one filled with forgotten lacquer, scrolls, silence. This time she sat not on the floor, but on a wooden stool she found beneath a pile of old kimonos. She held her own name in her mind for a moment. Not the name the guests used, not the name she was given as a child, but the quiet syllables that had once meant her and only her. She whispered them into the wood. Just once, the room heard. She stayed there until the light changed, until the smell of miso drifted through the hallways, until the house began to hum with the familiar rhythm of evening. When she emerged, the new girl, still nameless, still finding her voice, was waiting. "Outside, you disappeared," she said. The woman smiled. "I found something." "What?" The woman touched her chest. "The echo of when I was whole." The girl didn't understand. She didn't need to. That night, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of chrysanthemums and something older, perhaps pine smoke, perhaps memory. She stood by the open doorway and let it wrap around her. The feather she had found weeks ago still rested on her shelf, untouched. She picked it up and walked to the garden. Without ceremony, she placed it at the base of the camellia tree, next to the final slip of paper she had tied. "What you carry becomes part of you," she whispered, "but only if you learn when to set it down." The next morning, she rose before dawn and sat at her desk. She wrote one sentence on a blank sheet of rice paper. "I am no longer waiting to be remembered." She folded the paper carefully, tucked it into a small pouch, and placed it in the sleeve of her robe, not for anyone else, just so that the words could be close to her skin. That day, she taught the girls nothing. She asked no questions, offered no advice. She simply sat among them, sipping tea and listening as they shared dreams and doubts and laughter. It felt, for the first time, not like a performance but a communion. One of the girls began to cry softly, embarrassed by her own uncertainty. The woman reached out, not with words, but with her presence. She placed a hand on the girl's knee and let it rest there. The girl cried harder, and then stopped. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not fixing me." The woman smiled. Some things are not broken, only blooming. That evening, she passed through each room of the house, not as a farewell, but as a ritual. She touched the edge of the lacquer chest in the foyer. She straightened a scroll that had hung slightly askew. She refolded a scarf someone had left carelessly by the entrance. In the main chamber, she paused longest. There, among the cushions and sake trays and old songs, she had once performed like a flame bright, consuming, impossible to ignore. Now she stood as smoke present but ungraspable. She sat for a while in the center of the room. The floor creaked beneath her. The silence leaned in. She inhaled slowly and exhaled without sound. When she rose, she did not look back. That night, as the moon rose full and high, she stepped outside again, this time walking deeper into the garden. The trees whispered, and the gravel shifted beneath her feet. She paused by the koi pond and watched the water ripple. It reminded her of breath, of beginnings. She looked up at the stars, then down at her hands. They no longer trembled. She smiled, not from joy or sorrow, but from recognition. She was not the same as she had been, but she was still her. The quiet that remained inside her was no longer emptiness. It was presence, a fullness that did not demand to be spoken, a song without notes. And as she walked back toward the house, the wind rose softly behind her, carrying no message but itself. It was neither an end nor a beginning, but something quieter, a continuation that asked for no attention, no celebration, no announcement. The days had grown cool, the light more silver than gold, and even the birds seemed to sing less often. She walked slower now, not from fatigue, but from the kind of care reserved for those who know how little time asks of us once we stop resisting it. The house did not change, yet everything within it had softened. The girls spoke more freely, but with gentler voices. The walls, long polished by footsteps and hands, held warmth as if they remembered every story ever whispered beside them. She no longer kept a schedule. She woke when the light stirred her, slept when the silence gathered. She ate simply, savoring the bitterness of pickled radish, the sweetness of chestnut, the earthiness of tea. One morning, she stood before her mirror for a long while, not to adjust her hair or powder her face, but simply to witness herself. She had grown older, yes, but not in the way one grows tired. Her lines were not of worry, but of depth. Her eyes had not dimmed, only quieted. She thought of the first day she had entered this house, nervous, expectant, carrying too many versions of who she thought she should become. That girl had long vanished, replaced by someone less certain but more whole. She reached into her robe and pulled out the folded paper she had written weeks ago. "I am no longer waiting to be remembered." She smiled. Then, gently, she tore it in half and let the pieces fall to the floor. It was not erasure, it was release. Later that day, she sat in the garden and watched the camellia tree. A few late blossoms had appeared, pale and shy, as if uncertain of their welcome. She leaned back against the wooden post and closed her eyes. She heard footsteps approach, light and deliberate. It was Aki. "They're asking for you," she said. "Who?" the woman asked. "Everyone." The woman opened her eyes. "Then let them find me here." Aki hesitated, then sat beside her. They didn't speak for a long time. Wind moved through the leaves. Somewhere a bell rang. Finally, Aki asked, "Are you happy?" The woman turned her head, eyes half-lidded. "I am not seeking happiness," she said. "Only peace." "And have you found it?" "No," the woman answered. "But I have stopped looking in places it doesn't live." That night, the house was quiet. No performances. No visitors. Only candlelight and the soft rustle of robes as the girls prepared for rest. She remained in the corridor, watching the flames flicker. Then, without warning, she rose and walked to the main room. It was empty, save for the low table and a half-folded screen. She stepped onto the tatami and stood in the center. Slowly, she extended her arms, not in dance, not in greeting, but in stillness. She breathed in, then out. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then she turned and left the room. That was her last performance. Not because she would never move again, but because she no longer needed to be seen to exist. The next morning, she called the youngest girls together. She gave each of them a folded paper and said nothing. When they opened them, they found brushstrokes, some bold, some soft, some abstract, some delicate. None were signed. They're all different, one girl said. Of course, the woman replied. So are you. But what do they mean? The girl asked. Whatever you need them to. That afternoon, she sat by the open door once more, her fingers resting on her lap, her breath long and even. She thought of all the names she had worn, all the stories she had carried, all the gazes she had absorbed. None of them felt heavy now. She no longer felt the need to respond to anything but the moment before her. When the madam approached, her voice was softer than usual. You've become the house, she said. The woman tilted her head. No, I've become the space between its sounds. That evening, she gathered a small bundle of things. A scarf, a comb, a single hairpin, and a brush with no ink. She placed them in a wooden box and carried it to the garden. There, beneath the camellia tree, she buried it. Not deeply. Just enough. A returning, not a hiding. She pressed her palms to the earth. Let this feed what comes next, she whispered. The final night came without announcement. The girls moved as they always did. The wind blew gently through the halls. Tea steamed in quiet cups. The house breathed. She lay on her mat, eyes open, watching the shadows play on the ceiling. Aki came in, sat beside her, and took her hand. Will you be here tomorrow? She asked. The woman did not answer. She only smiled, closed her eyes, and let silence finish the sentence. When morning came, her mat was empty, her robe folded neatly, her slippers untouched. The girls searched, but not urgently. They did not cry. They moved slowly through the house, whispering soft prayers, touching the walls as if expecting them to whisper back. In the garden, the camellia tree had opened fully, its blossoms facing the sun. Beneath it, the earth was undisturbed, but something had changed. A softness in the air, a hush that was not absence, but presence. A kind of farewell that didn't need to be said aloud. A kind of ending that felt like the start of something still being written. And somewhere, on a breeze neither cold nor warm, a voice not spoken, but felt. I am here. Just not where I was.